The world knew Diane Lane as one of Hollywood's most graceful stars, an actress who carried herself with elegance, talent, and resilience through decades of a demanding career. On screen, she was radiant, often embodying characters who carried a mixture of strength and vulnerability. But beyond the cameras and red carpets, Diane was still human, with the same heart that could break, the same soul that could grow weary, and the same fears that could creep into the quiet hours of the night. When tragedy struck her family, it didn't make headlines at first. It wasn't the kind of spectacle the tabloids thrived on. It was quieter, more personal, more devastating in a way that no flashbulb or headline could ever capture. A loved one, someone she had leaned on for comfort during the most turbulent times of her life, was suddenly gone. The phone call that delivered the news seemed to echo endlessly in her mind, each word weighing heavier than the last. She remembered sitting on the edge of her bed, her hand pressed to her chest as though she could hold her heart together by force alone. Outside, the city of Los Angeles carried on with its usual hum. Cars rolling down the streets, neighbors walking their dogs, planes cutting across the night sky. But for Diane, the world had stopped. Everything around her blurred, leaving her sitting alone in the sharp stillness of grief. The days that followed were filled with silence she couldn't escape. Her home, once a sanctuary where she retreated from the chaos of Hollywood, felt unbearably empty. Every corner seemed to whisper reminders of what she had lost. The kitchen table where conversations used to spill into laughter. The living room where family photos captured memories of warmth. Even the hallway, dimly lit in the evening, felt like a corridor leading her deeper into sorrow. Diane found herself moving through the house as though it were no longer her own. She avoided mirrors because she didn't want to see the weariness in her own face, the lines that grief carved more deeply with each passing day. She tried to distract herself with television, with reading, with anything to drown out the ache, but nothing held her. Her scripts sat untouched on the counter, roles she once would have studied with meticulous care. Now the words seemed meaningless, empty on the page, incapable of filling the void in her chest. Even when her phone buzzed with messages, friends offering condolences, colleagues sending their sympathies, she rarely responded. The gestures were kind, but words on a screen couldn't reach her in the place where grief had locked her away. At night, the silence was worse. Diane would lie awake long after midnight, staring at the ceiling as memories of the person she lost circled her mind. She thought about the last conversation they had, replaying every word, every inflection, every moment of laughter or tenderness. She thought about the things left unsaid, the apologies not given, the gratitude not expressed, the simple "I love you" that should have been repeated 1,000 times more than it was. Regret, that heavy companion of grief, pressed down on her chest until breathing felt like a battle. She would get up, wander to the window, and stare out at the streetlights glowing faintly through the branches of the trees. She wondered how many others in the city were awake, nursing heartbreaks of their own, hiding their pain in the privacy of their homes. It didn't make her feel less alone, but it reminded her that sorrow, in some twisted way, was universal. Still, that knowledge did little to ease the sharpness of her own. The nights bled into mornings, and the mornings into afternoons, each day passing as a haze she could not fully enter. The tragedy also created a strange divide between Diane's public and private self. In the public eye, she was expected to remain composed, elegant, almost untouchable. Hollywood demanded its stars carry their pain in silence, as though to admit grief was a weakness. But at home, Diane was stripped of all performance. She was simply a woman in mourning. The magazines, the interviews, the premiere events, none of it mattered anymore. What was glamour when the world inside her had turned gray? Friends tried to coax her out, tried to remind her that life had to go on, that she couldn't lock herself away forever. But grief doesn't operate on anyone's timeline. Diane wasn't ready to perform, not for cameras, not for strangers, not even for friends. She found herself canceling engagements, avoiding gatherings, declining calls. The spotlight, once her second home, now felt like an unbearable intrusion. It was in these moments of solitude, when the lights were off and the mask of strength could finally slip, that Diane's heart truly revealed its wounds. She would cry until her voice was hoarse, until exhaustion finally dragged her into sleep. And in those vulnerable hours, she wondered if anyone could truly reach her in the depths of this sorrow. And yet, despite the heaviness, there was still a quiet resilience inside her, though she couldn't see it yet. Diane Lane had always been more than the roles she played. She had always carried a quiet dignity, even in the face of pain. But even the strongest souls need someone to sit with them in the darkness, someone who doesn't demand they be strong, someone who doesn't tell them to move on before they are ready. She didn't know it yet, but such a presence was on its way to her. Someone who understood grief in his own way. Someone who had walked through loneliness, who knew the hollow weight of loss and the importance of kindness. That someone was Keanu Reeves. At the moment, though, Diane could not imagine anyone breaking through the walls her sorrow had built. She believed she would have to face this alone. But fate had other plans, and soon, her story would intertwine with Keanu's in a way that would change both of them forever. Keanu Reeves had always lived with a peculiar awareness of sorrow. Despite his fame and the brilliance of his career, his life had been colored by tragedies that shaped him in ways invisible to most. Friends who knew him well often spoke of his rare sensitivity, the quiet way he carried himself, and the deep well of empathy that seemed to guide his every action. Keanu had faced the cruelty of loss more than once, losing people he loved dearly, facing isolation at the very moments when the world demanded his strength. Those experiences left him with an understanding that pain could not simply be brushed away with cliches or empty gestures. It had to be witnessed, honored, and carried with compassion. When news reached him that Diane Lane was grieving, it was not just a headline or idle gossip, it was something personal. They had known each other for years, through the web of Hollywood connections, shared events, and the mutual respect of two actors who valued substance over spectacle. Diane wasn't just another colleague to him, she was a person he admired, a soul who had walked her own difficult path with grace. To hear she was suffering struck a chord deep within him. The first he heard of it was through a mutual friend, an actor who had worked alongside both Diane and Keanu on different projects. The friend had spoken softly, with a kind of hesitation that suggested they didn't want to burden Keanu with the news, but knew it mattered. "She's not doing well," they had said, describing Diane's withdrawal, her silence, her grief. Keanu had listened quietly, not interrupting, his dark eyes fixed on some invisible point as though trying to imagine the weight she was carrying. For most, such news might have sparked sympathy and then quickly faded into the background of their busy lives. But Keanu was different. He knew what loneliness and grief felt like, the unbearable silence after the condolences stopped coming, after the world expected you to simply move forward as though nothing had happened. He remembered the nights when he too had sat alone, the world carrying on outside his window while his own life seemed frozen. That memory was enough to stir him to action. He couldn't allow Diane to endure this in isolation, not when he understood the terrain she was navigating. Still, Keanu was not impulsive. He considered how best to reach her. A phone call seemed too easy to ignore, too impersonal for something as raw as grief. A message could be lost in the sea of condolences, well-meaning but hollow. He wanted Diane to know that someone was willing to be there, not just say the words. And so, he made a choice that was both simple and profound. He would go to her, not as a co-star, not as a fellow celebrity, not as someone who expected to fix her pain, but simply as a friend willing to share in the silence. It was a gesture that reflected who Keanu truly was behind the headlines, a man who believed in showing up, in offering presence when words failed. That evening, he stopped at a small flower shop tucked away on a quiet street in West Hollywood. The shop owner recognized him instantly, though Keanu moved with the same humility as any other customer. He asked for a single white flower, something understated but meaningful. When handed the bloom, he paid without fuss, thanked the shopkeeper with genuine warmth, and stepped back into the cool evening air. To anyone watching, he might have looked like just another man carrying a flower down the street. But for Diane, that gesture would mean something immeasurable. When Keanu finally arrived at Diane's doorstep, the night had already settled over Los Angeles. The streets glowed with scattered lights, the hum of distant traffic carried on the breeze. He stood there for a moment, holding the flower, gathering his thoughts. He wasn't rehearsing words. He knew there were none that could erase grief. Instead, he was reminding himself of his purpose, to let Diane know she wasn't alone, that someone cared enough to stand in the shadows with her. He rang the bells softly, almost hesitant, as though not wanting to intrude too suddenly on the fragile stillness inside. When the door opened, Diane appeared in the dim light of the hallway. Her face bore the unmistakable marks of sleepless nights and unspoken sorrow. For a brief moment, surprise flickered across her eyes. She hadn't expected company, least of all Keanu Reeves standing quietly at her door with a single white flower in his hand. He didn't launch into platitudes or dramatic declarations. He simply met her gaze with a depth of understanding that said more than any words could. "I just wanted to see you," he murmured, his voice steady, gentle. It wasn't a demand or an obligation, it was an offering. And in that instant, Diane felt the smallest crack form in the wall she had built around herself. The truth was, grief often convinces us that no one can truly reach us, that our pain is too unique, too deep for others to understand. But Keanu's presence carried with it a reminder that while no one could erase her loss, she didn't have to face it in absolute solitude. She hesitated at first, torn between the instinct to retreat further into her shell and the quiet relief of not being alone. But then, almost instinctively, she stepped aside and let him in. The air inside the house was heavy, thick with silence, but Keanu moved with quiet ease, respecting the space, not trying to fill it with unnecessary chatter. He placed the flower in a small vase on the table, its simple beauty offering a touch of gentleness in a room clouded by sorrow. For Diane, that moment was more than just a visit. It was the first sign that perhaps she didn't have to navigate this storm alone. Keanu had learned the truth of her pain, and instead of keeping his distance, he had come closer. Not to fix her, not to rush her through the process of healing, but simply to stand beside her in the dark. And sometimes, that is the greatest gift one soul can offer another. Inside Diane's home, the silence wrapped around them like a heavy blanket. It was not the kind of silence that invited comfort, but the kind that pressed against the chest, making every breath a little more difficult. Diane led Keanu into the living room, where the dim glow of a single lamp softened the edges of the space. Books lay scattered on the coffee table, a half-empty cup of tea sat forgotten beside them, and a stack of unopened mail rested near the couch. The room carried the unmistakable imprint of someone who had been going through the motions of living without truly being present. Diane lowered herself onto the couch, her posture slouched, her eyes dull with exhaustion. She glanced at Keanu briefly, as though unsure what to expect, and then lowered her gaze again, afraid of revealing too much. Keanu, sensing her hesitation, sat in the chair opposite her, not too close to invade, not too far to seem distant. He didn't rush to fill the air with words. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands loosely clasped. His presence was steady, grounding, a quiet reassurance that he was there with no agenda, no performance, just genuine care. Diane tried to speak, to break the silence, but the words caught in her throat. For days, she had ignored phone calls and avoided conversations, because she didn't have the strength to recount her loss or endure the shallow reassurances people often gave. But something about Keanu's stillness felt different. He wasn't looking at her with pity, nor with the impatience of someone hoping she would move on. He was simply there, giving her the space to exist as she was, broken, grieving, and unsteady. Her lips parted, trembling, and finally, the words spilled out, "It doesn't make sense. None of it makes sense." Her voice cracked as tears welled in her eyes. She pressed her palms together, as though trying to hold herself upright while her emotions crumbled inside her. One day they were here, and the next, she trailed off, unable to finish, her breath hitching with the effort to contain her sobs. For the first time since the loss, Diane allowed herself to unravel in front of another person. The tears flowed freely, raw and unrestrained, each one carrying the weight of sleepless nights and suffocating loneliness. Keanu didn't interrupt her. He didn't tell her to be strong, didn't offer hollow phrases like, "time heals," or, "they're in a better place." He knew too well how meaningless such words could feel in the face of grief. Instead, he rose quietly and moved to sit beside her on the couch. His movements were gentle, deliberate, giving her every chance to retreat if she needed space. But Diane didn't pull away. When he sat down, she instinctively leaned toward him, her shoulder brushing against his. And then, without hesitation, Keanu placed his hand over hers, a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. His hand was warm, steady, and it anchored her in a way that words never could. For Diane, the touch was a reminder that she wasn't floating alone in a sea of sorrow. Someone was there, holding her hand, tethering her to the present moment. The dam inside her broke. She buried her face in her hands, her sobs filling the quiet room, and Keanu sat with her, absorbing the weight of her pain without flinching. He didn't try to fix her grief. He bore witness to it, which was something far more powerful. Time seemed to stretch in that moment. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, but for Diane, the world outside faded away. Her sobs slowed, replaced by shaky breaths, her body leaning more heavily against Keanu's side. When she finally lifted her face, her eyes red and swollen, she glanced at him, almost embarrassed by her vulnerability. But Keanu's gaze held nothing but calm understanding. There was no judgment, no discomfort, only a quiet acknowledgement of her pain. "It's okay," he said softly, the words more like a reassurance than advice. "You don't have to go through this alone." The simplicity of his statement struck her deeply. For days, she had been convinced that no one could truly understand, that her grief was hers alone to endure. But Keanu's presence had chipped away at that belief. She realized she hadn't spoken so freely to anyone since the tragedy. In this room, in this moment, she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks, the faint but undeniable comfort of companionship. The night lingered on, and though the conversation remained sparse, it carried a depth that didn't require constant words. Diane shared fragments of memories, small stories about the person she had lost, little details that might have seemed trivial to others but were precious to her. Keanu listened with unwavering attention, nodding gently, sometimes offering a small smile when a memory carried warmth amid the sadness. It was clear he wasn't just hearing her. He was listening, honoring every word as though it mattered. And it did. Each memory spoken aloud kept her loved one alive in some way, transforming the silence of grief into a space where remembrance could coexist with healing. At one point, Diane glanced at the white flower Keanu had placed in the vase earlier. Its quiet presence in the room mirrored his own, a symbol of gentleness in the midst of sorrow. For the first time since her loss, Diane felt the heaviness in her chest lift, if only slightly. It wasn't that her pain had disappeared, it was that it no longer felt insurmountable. And she realized it was because Keanu had chosen to sit with her in the darkness, reminding her that even in grief, there could be moments of light. In the days that followed, Diane Lane found herself reflecting often on the night Keanu had come to her home. It wasn't that he had said anything extraordinary, he hadn't delivered some profound speech or promised to erase her grief. What lingered in her mind was his presence, the quiet way he sat beside her, the patience in his silence, the gentle reassurance that she wasn't as alone as she had believed. That night had marked the beginning of a fragile shift in her heart. She was still grieving, still walking through shadows, but she was no longer utterly isolated. Keanu had reminded her that even in sorrow, companionship mattered. What Diane didn't realize, however, was that Keanu wasn't finished. He carried with him a belief that grief deserved to be honored, not avoided. To him, loss was not something to sweep away with platitudes. It was something to face with sincerity, with gestures that spoke to the soul. And quietly, without Diane's knowledge, he began to plan something that would become a turning point in her healing. Keanu had always been wary of grand displays. In a world where celebrity culture thrived on spectacle, he preferred simplicity. Yet, simplicity did not mean emptiness, it meant authenticity. He reached out discreetly to a few of Diane's closest friends and family, people he knew she trusted, and asked them to gather. His idea was not to create a public memorial or an event meant for cameras, but rather a private tribute, an intimate evening where those who loved Diane, and those who had also loved the one she lost, could share memories together. He wanted to create a space where grief could be held collectively, where Diane could feel supported not only by him, but by a circle of care that surrounded her. He chose a quiet garden belonging to a mutual friend, a place far removed from the eyes of Hollywood, where lanterns could be lit and candles could glow softly under the night sky. It would be a sanctuary, if only for a few hours, where loss could be spoken aloud and love could be remembered. When the evening arrived, Diane was unaware of what awaited her. Keanu had asked her to meet him, keeping the details vague, assuring her only that it was something he hoped would bring comfort. She was hesitant. Grief had made her wary of gatherings, of facing others when she felt so raw, but something in his voice convinced her to trust him. As they drove together to the garden, the air between them was quiet but steady. Diane gazed out the window, wondering what she was walking into, while Keanu remained calm, his focus on the road, his presence reassuring as ever. When they arrived, Diane stepped out of the car and was met by the sight of soft candlelight flickering in the darkness. The garden was alive with warmth, candles placed along pathways, lanterns hanging from tree branches, a gentle glow that made the night feel less heavy. And then, as she walked further in, she saw the faces. Friends she hadn't seen in weeks. Family members who had been giving her space. People who loved her, all gathered quietly, waiting not to demand her strength but to share in her sorrow. At the center stood a small table, upon which rested photographs, mementos, and the single white flower Keanu had given her days before. For a long moment, Diane couldn't speak. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears that blurred the sight before her. It wasn't the kind of surprise that overwhelmed her with noise and excitement. It was the kind that went straight to the heart, leaving her breathless with its sincerity. She turned toward Keanu, her voice trembling as she whispered, "You did this." He nodded gently, his expression soft, his eyes carrying that same depth of understanding she had seen before. "You shouldn't have to grieve alone," he said simply. "Sometimes we need to remember together." Those words unlocked something inside Diane. She stepped forward, her gaze sweeping across the photographs, the candles, the faces of people who had loved alongside her. Slowly, she felt the weight on her chest ease, not because the pain was gone, but because it was shared. The tribute unfolded quietly. Stories were told, memories exchanged, laughter mingled with tears. It was not a performance, not an event for publicity. It was something deeply human. And through it all, Keanu remained by her side, not seeking recognition, not drawing attention to himself, but simply being there, a steady presence in the midst of it all. By the end of the evening, Diane felt something she hadn't felt in weeks, a sense of release. She realized that grief didn't have to be carried in silence, that healing could begin when sorrow was met with love. She stood in the glow of the candles, surrounded by people who cared for her, and she looked at Keanu with gratitude so deep it was almost overwhelming. What he had done was not flashy, not the kind of grand gesture the world might expect from a star of his stature. It was something far more rare, a gesture of true compassion, born not of obligation but of genuine humanity. And in that moment, Diane understood why people spoke of Keanu Reeves with such reverence, not just as an actor, but as a man whose kindness transcended fame. What he had done for her was not just shocking in its thoughtfulness, it was transformative. It reminded her that even in the darkest seasons of life, there were people willing to bring light, if only we allowed them to. The night had been long, heavy with a weight of emotions that neither Diane Lane nor Keanu Reeves could fully name. Yet as dawn crept over the horizon, brushing the Los Angeles skyline with soft gold, the silence between them no longer felt like emptiness, it felt like understanding. Diane, who had spent weeks drowning in grief, finally sensed a small flicker of peace. For the first time since her devastating loss, she felt a quietness in her chest that was not suffocating, but soothing. She glanced at Keanu, who was pouring coffee in her kitchen, moving with the same calm, unhurried presence that had been her anchor through the storm. Something inside her knew that words could no longer remain unspoken. She had to tell him how much he meant to her, not just for what he had done, but for what he had restored within her. The courage to live again. Her voice trembled at first, breaking the quiet morning air. "Keanu, I don't know how to thank you," she said, the words carrying the weight of sleepless nights, of tears shed in solitude, of fears she thought she'd never conquer. She looked at him, her eyes reflecting both the fragility of her wounds and the strength she was slowly reclaiming. "You didn't just show up for me. You carried me when I couldn't walk. You reminded me that grief doesn't mean the end of love, it means love is still alive." Her hands shook as she held the mug he had placed before her. "I thought I was drowning, and I wanted to let the tide take me. But you," she paused, swallowing the lump in her throat, "you reminded me that I still had breath in my lungs. That maybe, just maybe, there is more life waiting for me beyond the pain." Keanu didn't interrupt. He never did. He simply listened, as he always had, his presence more eloquent than any words could ever be. Diane felt her heart crack open wider, but this time it wasn't with sorrow, it was with gratitude. She set the mug down and leaned forward, her voice steadying. "You know, everyone talks about your kindness as if it's a story, something people share online because it's rare. But for me, it wasn't a headline or a rumor. It was real. It was here, in my darkest moments. You didn't come with grand gestures or promises you couldn't keep. You came with silence, with patience, with truth. And that is something I'll never forget." Tears welled in her eyes again, but they were different now, lighter, almost freeing. "You didn't just comfort me after a loss, Keanu. You gave me back a reason to keep going." As the words spilled from her heart, Diane realized she was no longer speaking only to Keanu, she was speaking to herself, too. It was a confession, a reclamation of her strength, a declaration that grief had not destroyed her but reshaped her. Keanu simply nodded, his eyes soft with the quiet humility that defined him. He didn't take credit for saving her, because he never saw himself as a savior. To him, he had only been a friend doing what was right. But Diane knew better. She knew the difference between someone who showed up out of duty and someone who showed up out of love. Love in its purest form, not romantic, not transactional, but human. The kind of love that sees you at your lowest and still chooses to stand beside you. And that, she thought, was rarer than anything fame or fortune could ever offer. The morning sun streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the kitchen as Diane's words lingered in the air. They were not dramatic, not meant for an audience, not scripted for a film. They were raw, unpolished truths. In that moment, she understood that her healing had not come from forgetting her loss, but from remembering that she was not alone in it. Keanu had given her that gift, and her gratitude was a bridge back to life. "I don't know what tomorrow holds," Diane whispered finally, her voice steady now. "But I know I'll face it. And that's because of you." Keanu reached across the table, placed his hand gently over hers, and with a quiet smile, said only, "You were never alone." For Diane, those words were the final piece she needed. Not closure, but a beginning. The first step into a life where grief and love could coexist, and where hope, fragile yet unbreakable, could rise again.